Déjà vu, a French phrase meaning already seen, a 2006 hit single by Beyonce, and the only way to describe the feeling I had on January 8th, 2023. That's when footage came out of Brazil showing former President Bolsonaro's supporters violently storming the capital's Congress, Supreme Court, and presidential palace. The American media immediately started comparing the attack to the events of January 6th, 2021. Some have even gone so far as to call January 6th a blueprint for what happened in Brasilia. The shared imagery from the two events is striking and makes such a comparison tempting. But was this in fact a reboot of January 6th, or is it way more complicated? And either way, what are we to make of the parallel events? What's more, when the US projects its own political climate onto other countries, do we all risk losing sight of much broader global issues? Well, let's find out in this Wisecrack Edition. Did Brazil just reboot January 6th? Let's start by addressing the obvious. What happened on January 6th, 2021 in Washington, D.C. has a hell of a lot of similarities to what went down this year on January 8th in Brasilia. In both cases, mobs of protesters forced their way into government buildings. In both cases, the attacks were spurred by popular conspiracy theories and online misinformation about rigged elections. These conspiracy theories had, at the time, convinced significant portions of each population. In both cases, rioters attacked police officers standing in their way. Also notably, in both cases, some police officers did little to stop the rioters or even encourage them. After making it into the buildings, both groups didn't seem to have a clear plan of action. Many just milled around on self-guided tours or took flattering selfies that definitely weren't at all self-incriminating. Self-snitchers. Many others, though, started destroying property, breaking windows, tearing through lawmakers' offices, and generally inspiring vibes of an Animal House food fight. If a food fight had the power to symbolically upend democracy. In Brazil, the damage was particularly staggering. Priceless works of art were torn from their canvases. Marble sinks were ripped out of bathrooms, and there was even an attempt to set fire to the carpet of Congress. Both attacks were publicized on social media, and rioters used apps like Telegram and WhatsApp to coordinate their efforts. Oh, also, the figureheads inspiring both groups, Bolsonaro and Trump, share similar political worldviews, Bolsonaro being called the Trump of the tropics. They've also fostered a well-publicized alliance. What's more, both of their political careers have relied heavily on weaponizing social media. Trump tweeted his way into the White House, while Bolsonaro's frequent use of Facebook Live was essential to attracting the zealous support that led to the January 8th riots. Given all these superficial similarities, it's not especially surprising that a lot of us saw January 8th as an international reboot of the insurrection that rocked our own country's political climate. But the differences between the two events might be more illuminating than the similarities. First and most significantly, Brazil is a young democracy. In 1964, it underwent a military coup that, though homegrown, was supported by the United States due to its purported efforts to fight the threat of communism. And this wasn't even the only military dictatorship Brazil experienced in the 20th century. It wasn't until 21 years later, in 1985, that the country transitioned into a democracy, meaning plenty of geriatric millennials are older than its democratic institutions, self included, and if you ever call me a geriatric millennial to my face, I'll do an insurrection on that ass. That sounded sexual. I didn't mean it sexual, but I get that it did. This arguably makes any threat to, say, the success of a democratic election or the peaceful transfer of power more fraught and more dire as compared to the United States. Historian Andre Pagliarini told PBS that in Brazil, democracy is relatively young. This makes the threat of an incident like the Brasilia riot feel more dangerous, because there is a living memory of military intervention in a way there simply isn't in the US. What's more, the prevailing sense among many elite and working class Brazilians alike that life was better under the dictatorship adds to the perennial sense that young democracies can be fragile. Also importantly, Bolsonaro has, throughout his political career, signaled support for the former military dictatorship, a dictatorship which the country's National Truth Commission estimates murdered or disappeared more than 400 people and tortured more than 20,000. In 1999, Bolsonaro even argued that the military dictatorship hadn't gone far enough. In contrast, America's well-worn institutions after 2.5 centuries of functioning are, like your grandparents, pretty boring and reliable. And maybe also like your grandparents, the more you think about them, you realize they're kind of messed up and racist the whole time. However, the rioters in Brasilia differed from those in Washington in another key way: their purpose. The US rioters invaded a max-capacity Capitol filled with members of the House trying to do their jobs, hoping to stop the election from being certified. They even rallied to hang Mike Pence to make the proceedings stop. In contrast, rioters in Brazil forced their way into totally empty buildings while the president-elect was away comforting flood victims. And ex-President Bolsonaro was wandering the aisles of beloved Florida grocery store Publix. If you've been to a Publix and had a Publix sub, let us know your order in the comments. Mine would be a chicken tender sub tossed in buffalo sauce, lettuce, tomato, onion, pickle, banana peppers, oil and vinegar, salt and pepper. Done. Pagliarini explains that the Brasilia riot wasn't about forestalling an election certification, a swearing-in ceremony, or anything like that. It was more about signaling a rejection of a democratic outcome they abhor. The events of January 6th are also completely inextricable from Trump, who gave a speech earlier that day instructing his supporters to march to the Capitol and fight like hell. In contrast, Bolsonaro wasn't even in Brazil at the time of the riots. He'd already retreated to Florida, the favored haven of many a former Latin American despot. And Trump, and my mom, who is not a former Latin American despot, at least that I know of. Pagliarini views the symbolic rather than practical nature of the January 8th attacks as a sign that the anti-democratic wave inspired by Bolsonaro has transcended the leader himself. In contrast, the events of January 6th were clearly wedded to keeping Trump in power. Given all this, it's no wonder political economist David Adler calls the kind of question we first posed narcissistic, an instance of Americentrism, which is the tendency to view the world through a US-focused lens. A lens that takes for granted that it's a dominant global force, often to the exclusion of other countries' autonomy over their politics and culture. Don't blame us, blame McDonald's, Starbucks, KFC, reruns of Friends. The notion that the Brazilian far right was copying America's own similar faction feeds into a prevailing mythos that cultural and political phenomena in the Western Hemisphere, including the rise of the alt-right, tend to travel north to south. And that oversimplification really isn't borne out by history, particularly if you look to the history of far-right movements in both countries. As scholar Benjamin A. Cowan writes, accounts from the North tend to ignore the simultaneity of right-wing religious ascendancy in Brazil and the United States. Indeed, as the Christian right was gestating in the United States in the 60s and 70s, Brazil contemporaneously became fertile territory for the flourishing of right-wing religious ideas and networks. That's in part because religious far-right movements had the support, tacit and active, of the dictatorship. The dictatorship supported them because prior to the coup, these conservative Christian groups had taken to the streets to call for military intervention. Because we all know, if Jesus loved one thing, it was military intervention. This can also be credited partially to American missionaries, who spread their brand of religion across South America. Reacting to that era's communist threat, as well as the general specter of secular modernism, with all its hippies and feminists and rock and roll, Brazilian religious activists like Everaldo Dias Pereira argued that the danger was transnational. They saw themselves as part of global struggles for the soul not only of their country, but of the West and the world. Sinfulness, they believed, was especially prevalent in the US, a fear that encouraged reverse missionaries who went from Brazil to the United States seeking to save souls from American decadence. If you chuckled or smiled at all when I said reverse missionaries, let us know in the comments. Or maybe it was just me, I don't know. I want to see who else has a deprived soul that needs a missionary from Brazil to come and save you in reverse. Brazilian activists also founded influential organizations like the Brazilian Society for the Defense of Tradition, Family, and Property, which would eventually become international with its strongest foothold in the US. I never would have guessed an organization defending tradition, family, and property would have a strong foothold right here in the US of A. In this way, Brazilian activists, according to Cowan, created organizations and nourished alliances that facilitated the construction of today's transnational Christian conservatism. United States evangelical activists frequently traveled to Brazil and looked to its success in fostering a far-right religious movement at home and abroad for inspiration and tactics. All of which is to say, arguing that today's Brazilian far-right needs to look to the United States for inspiration ignores the extent to which Brazil's far-right activism inspired not my right-wing activism, not Wisecrack, Michael Burns, apolitical, objective, no opinions, no values, an empty void that information travels through to you, just so we're clear. But this also speaks to something important about the contemporary far right. While we tend to think of these as separate nationalist movements existing within the borders of individual countries, it's more helpful to think of them as constituting one big transnational movement. Indeed, Steve Bannon visited Brazil hoping to learn tactics from Bolsonaro that would aid his attempts in fostering said movement. Bolsonaro's son has even joined Bannon on this pursuit. Transnationalism has, of course, only been made easier with the rise of social media. And that's where viewing this through an American-centrist lens rings especially hollow. As deputy editor of the German news weekly Die Zeit, Yasin Musharbish writes, right-wing extremists today, in many cases, no longer subscribe to the narrow concept of nationalism, but instead imagine themselves as participants in a global struggle against a global enemy. Consequently, networking and cooperating across borders is seen as a necessity. Right-wing figureheads in one country might inspire those in another. A treatise written in one country might do the same. The Counter-Extremism Project argues that this phenomenon accelerated after 2014, leading to the emergence of a new leaderless, transnational, and apocalyptic violent extreme right-wing movement. Ooh. Musharbish writes that it's universally understood amongst experts that new technology like social media and encrypted chat apps has made such networking far easier and more widespread. While outreach and exchange of, say, right-wing magazines between activists in the 1960s and 70s helped facilitate the rise of the far right in both Brazil and the United States, the rise of social media has facilitated an even more intensely global far right that cross-pollinates ideas and strategies. Rather than any one country setting an example for another, then, it's far more helpful to think of them as existing in dialogue. But what is that dialogue really about? That is to say, what does the transnational far right actually want? Aside from symbolic notions of a return to a mythical yesteryear, which is part and parcel with white supremacy, it's not totally clear. But right-wing online activism that fosters the kind of misinformation about legitimate elections that inspired both January 6th and January 8th has more than a whiff of conspiracy to it. And according to political scientists Russell Muirhead and Nancy Rosenblum, this recent emergence of such conspiracizing is fundamentally different from, say, the speculation that surrounded the aftermath of JFK's assassination. If you know who killed JFK, let us know in the comments. After that event, people relentlessly rewatched footage, analyzed every piece of data, and obsessed over the evidence in hopes of coming to a desired conclusion. Today, instead, Muirhead and Rosenblum argue that we're in an era of new conspiracism, with conspiracism meaning conspiracy without any real theory behind it. They argue that in contrast to, say, the real events of JFK's assassination, in the new conspiracism, there is often nothing to explain. They note that the new conspiracism sometimes seems to arise out of thin air. The lack of evidence in this climate is compensated for by the blanket force of repetition. Repetition which all too often takes place on social media. Just think of Bolsonaro's near constant presence on Facebook Live, where he repeated his assertions of election fraud with confidence, despite having no tangible evidence. The end result? Well, the new conspiracism serves to sever the connection between assertions and beliefs on the one hand and anything verifiable in the world on the other. This immunizes conspiracist claims from scrutiny and doubt. What follows is that the new conspiracists undercut not only knowledge, but also skepticism. What's more, they say, conspiracism becomes about more than mere beliefs. It becomes integral to a person's identity. This stronger emotional attachment to conspiracism arguably renders violence more likely. The authors argue that in this way, the increased breakdown of facts is a danger to democracy. And we've seen that danger borne out in both the January 6th and January 8th attacks. Presumably, as the new conspiracism continues to travel globally, it's possible we'll see more of its violent inevitabilities. So, in such a climate, asking who inspired who in these specific events starts to feel like an almost purposefully simplistic approach, or like a way to ignore the broader transnational forces at work inspiring the far right. The truth is, in the age of global digital media, inspiration for fundamentally anti-democratic acts is everywhere. And that's a pretty scary place to land. So what do you think? When we compare January 8th to January 6th, are we missing the bigger point? What should we make of the transnational alt-right movement? And is there any way to escape our era of global conspiracism? Let us know what you think in the comments, and please do like the video and subscribe. It really helps us out. If you want to participate in a global conspiracy for democracy, think about joining our Patreon. Our loyal and wonderful patrons help us make the content we make. They support the channel and they get some extra content in return. If you want to join this secret cabal, there is a link in the description. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you later.